Greetings all. It's another Sunday and another episode of Album Rankings. This one was to make up for the one I didn't get to do last week due to an illness. For the first of two album rankings videos for this week, I'll take on the unbelievable task in ranking all of Black Sabbath's studio albums, from worst to best. And this was a difficult ranking to do. So anyway, when you're done watching this video, feel free to watch previous album rankings videos. The playlist is in the description box. Here we go. Okay, starting out, what has to be the worst Black Sabbath album happens to be in 20th place, Forbidden, released in 1995. This album got negative reviews from critics and fans alike. Maybe it had something to do with Ernie C., who produced the album. Ernie C. is a member of Ice-T's group Body Count. Tony Iommi was not very pleased with how this production and mixing came with the album, and I can't blame him. The one song that really stood out was the ballad I Won't Cry For You. Thankfully, this year, a remix of this record came out as part of the Tony Martin era box set called Anno Domini, 1989 to 1995. I bet the die-hard Sabbath fans will get to enjoy the remix version of this album better than the original. Next. In 19th place, it's Eternal Idol from 1987. I'm not sure how to react on this record. All this was the end of Black Sabbath's relationship with Warner Brothers in North America and Vertigo Records for the rest of the world until 26 years later. Most of the problem had a lot to do with Sabbath's never-ending lineup changes, first with Ray Gillen, and then with Tony Martin on lead vocals. Truth of the matter is, none of the songs stood out in the record at all. Hated it. In 18th, it's Never Say Die, from 1978. It was the last studio album to feature all four original members. The record received mixed reviews, with critics calling it unbalanced and insisting that its energy was scattered in too many directions. And following the tour of this record, Ozzy Osbourne got fired over substance abuse issues. The only stood out track for me was the title track, Never Say Die. Next. At 17, it's Seven Star from 1986. This record initially was supposed to be Tony Iommi's solo record after Geezer Butler left the group following the Born Again tour. However, pressures from Warner Brothers Records and manager Don Arden, what a piece of fucking work he is, decided it was going to be billed as Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi. Despite issues behind the release's production, it earned moderate commercial success, entering the top 30 in the UK and number 78 on the Billboard 200. And on a lighter note, this featured Glenn Hughes on lead vocals, and it featured the one stood-out song that called No Stranger to Love. Next. Now in 16th place, I didn't think I'd put this on the list because it's Dio with Sabbath, but under a different name. Heaven and Hell's The Devil You Know from 2009. This album was Ronnie James Dio's magnum opus, because in a year's time, we would lose the man due to stomach cancer. And by the way, check out my album review episode, album rankings episode, when I covered all of Dio's studio albums. The Dio Band, by the way, if you haven't already. The album surprisingly got positive reviews. The one song off this record that really stood out was Bible Black. The Devil You Know is a good release, but it's not as great as The Mob Rules or Heaven and Hell. Just saying, people, don't kill me in the comments. In 15th place is Technical Ecstasy from 1976. What the hell is with the album cover? See, what they did was separate themselves from the doom and gloom stuff that made them successful in their earlier releases, so the band had to experiment and explore other musical territories. I don't have a problem with bands experimenting, but Black Sabbath? Why? Why fuck up a good thing you had? I guess I'll never know. The only songs that really stood out on this one was Dirty Women and It's Alright, which was sung by drummer Bill Ward because Ozzy himself refused to sing it. Next, in 14th place, it's Sabotage from 1975. This was the album where Black Sabbath had legal issues with their former management because the band felt that their ex-manager at the time, Patrick Meehan, was sabotaging their careers. Following the July 1975 release, of this record, Sabotage made it to the top 30 on the Billboard 200 and the top 10 in the UK. Charts certified in gold and silver on those same countries respectively. There was one song that stood out for me on this one, and that was Symptom of the Universe. In 13th place, it's Born Again from 1983. The only Black Sabbath album to feature Deep Purple's Ian Gillan on lead vocals, and the last album for bassist Geezer Butler until 1992's Dehumanizer. I had recently watched a documentary on the making of Born Again on YouTube recently, and the band tells a story about making the sound themselves. While it was a commercial success, they failed to reach platinum or gold status in the US, but managed to make this record the highest charting album in their home country since Sabbath's Bloody Sabbath 10 years earlier. Trashed, Disturbing the Priest, and Digital Bitch are without a doubt the songs that stood out. At number 12 is Tear from 1990. This one was a departure from the darker lyrics from their most recent disc, Headless Cross. This was more of a concept album where the title and several songs allude to Norse mythology. While I can acknowledge them for experimenting in Norse mythology, not many Sabbath diehards were too keen on the concept at all. I kind of dug it because of the songs The Sabbath Stones, Jerusalem, Anno Mundi, Heaven in Black, and Feels Good to Me. Next, number 11, the aforementioned Headless Cross from 1989. Listening back some 35 years later, they had some awesome tracks. Mostly Headless Cross stood out. But as the years went on, I dug songs like Devil and Daughter, Call of the Wild, Nightwing, and When Death Calls, which features a guest appearance by Queen's Brian May on additional guitar. Dearly noted, Tony Iommi and Brian May are longtime friends. I'm very proud of this Black Sabbath album. Next, we now hit the top 10, and in 10th place is 13 from 2013. You know, I wasn't surprised when Ozzy did get to reconnect with Tony and Geezer to do this last Black Sabbath album, but the sad thing about it, and I don't know if it was hatred or whatever the cause was, but I wish Bill Ward would have played on this record. Why he never did it, I don't know. Maybe you guys in the comments know what the story was. But the record was produced by music icon and legend Rick Rubin. And this record is the only Black Sabbath album to make it to number 1 on the Billboard 200 in the US, and went number 1 in their home country, the UK, as well. God is Dead and The End of the Beginning were the only songs that stood out. A fantastic record. I'm pretty certain Ozzy, Geezer, and Tony are proud of this record. Next, in 9th place is Dehumanizer from 1992. Ronnie James Dio sacrificed his own band following the failure of 1990's Lock Up the Wolves, hooked back up with Tony and Geezer and longtime drummer Vinny Appice to make this record. This was the first Black Sabbath record I've gotten, and I will cherish this one for the rest of my life. Dio and Sabbath had unlimited potential to equally be, if not more successful than when Ozzy fronted the band. However, by the end of 1992, that was never meant to be, and there was a story behind that, but that's a story for another time. Half the songs on this album really stood out, like the single TV Crimes. Dehumanizer saw Sabbath resurge up the charts in both the US and the UK, reaching numbers 44 and 28 respectively. Next, in 8th place is Cross Purposes from 1994. Tony Martin returns to Sabbath after Dio walked out. And I have to be honest, Cross Purposes is that Black Sabbath album that shows singer Tony Martin at his very best. A critic once said that Cross Purposes is the first album since The Mob Rules that sounded like a real Black Sabbath album. He's right. While not a hit record in the States, it peaked at number 41 in the UK, while in other countries like Sweden and Finland it made it to the top 10. I love the songs Cross the Thorns, Dying for Love, Virtual Death, and The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. True story, the music video The Hand That Rocks the Cradle was what made me get this album, Cross Purposes, and I'm glad I did. Another Black Sabbath album I'll cherish for the rest of my life. In 7th place is Mob Rules from 1981. the aforementioned Mob Rules, the second Black Sabbath album to feature Ronnie Dio on lead vocals, and the first to feature Vinny Appice on drums. Made it to the top 30 on the Billboard charts, peaked at number 12 in the UK, and songs like Mob Rules, Sign of the Southern Cross, and Turn Up the Night really stood out. I recently covered this on my album review series just last week. In 6th place is the self-titled debut album Black Sabbath from 1970. The self-titled debut, some say that this album was the birth of heavy metal, others say it was Paranoid. The first Sabbath record initially received negative reviews, generally, despite a little commercial success, reaching the top 10 in the UK and number 23 in the US Billboard 200. However, in retrospect, this one got reappraisal as one of the greatest and most influential heavy metal records of all time. The songs that really stood out were like Black Sabbath, The Wizard, and N.I.B. Next. In 5th place, it's Volume 4 from 1972. This Black Sabbath album was one of their weakest in their early days, because they had a good producer in Roger Bain, but somehow he quit, and then the band turned to their then manager to help co-produce it. What the fuck were they thinking? Oh, I know. It was the hard drugs they were getting into at the time. However, despite how weak Volume 4 was, I won't deny its commercial success. Reaching the top 15 on the Billboard 200, it was a top 5 album in the UK, and it went platinum and gold in their respective countries. Songs like Tomorrow's Dream, Changes, Supernaut were really stood out, and I also love the instrumental version of Laguna Sunrise. As for the rest of the album, it was some weak ass shit. In 4th place, it's Sabbath Bloody Sabbath from 1973. Classic Black Sabbath at its peak. And what I mean by that is the album showed Ozzy, Bill, Tony, and Geezer at their creative best. Despite the fact they were all fucked up on drugs and alcohol, I have got to do an album review on this record in the near future. Anyway, since its 1973 release, the record made it to number 11 on the Billboard 200 and went platinum, and reached number 4 in the UK and went gold. The tracks that stood out were Spiral Architect, Killing Yourself to Live, Sabracadabra, A National Acrobat, and of course, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Next, in 3rd place is Master of Reality from 1971. Master of Reality is regarded by some critics as doom metal, stoner rock, sludge metal, whatever the hell you want to call it. This record helped create more subgenres, not just the 3 I just mentioned. This double platinum record made it to the top 10 of the Billboard 200 here in the US, while it reached top 5 status in the UK. This album picked up where Paranoid left off. The only song that really stood out was Children of the Grave, one of my favorite Sabbath songs, by the way. Next, we're down to the final 2, and in 2nd place, it's Paranoid from 1970. Great album. A lot of great songs on there like War Pigs, Iron Man, Electric Funeral, Hand of Doom, Planet Caravan, and of course Paranoid. Paranoid became Sabbath's first number 1 record in the UK, but would not reach its feet again until 13 in 2013. And even though it reached number 12 on the Billboard 200, it remains Black Sabbath's biggest selling album in the US, going 4 times platinum. Not bad for a second studio album, eh? And the best Black Sabbath album on this rankings list is Heaven and Hell from 1980. After a bad falling out with Ozzy in 79, Tony, Geezer, and Bill were introduced to Ronnie James Dio from Rainbow and Elf beforehand, and those 4 created a masterpiece, what would become Heaven and Hell. An album that Ronnie Dio himself is very proud of and all the work he and the rest of Sabbath put into it. I also covered this on my album review series recently, and I had no idea how special this album was to fans. So it was very tough for me to choose the top spot. While Paranoid was a major success for Ozzy when he was with Sabbath, Heaven and Hell with Dio and Sabbath was a masterpiece. Here is a quick recap once again. This was a more difficult video of album rankings that I ever did. Again, I'll probably get flack from other Sabbath fans in the comments, and that's fine. I'm open to criticism. Why, I even watched Ruthless Metal's video when he ranked all of Black Sabbath's albums. And he has good solid points, the Sabbath albums he ranked, but I disagree with the order he had them in. So real quickly, Heaven and Hell's The Devil You Know is technically not a Black Sabbath record, but it did feature the Mob Rules era lineup of Sabbath when this album was made. So, again, Ronnie James Dio, rest in peace. We all miss you. Next.
No.